Hi friends, it's Pastor Ben coming to you again with another chapter out of Ecclesiastes. I hope this video finds you well. I hope wherever you are, you're feeling the love and the comfort of Christ in this moment as the Holy Spirit shares with you, touches your heart and mind. And I hope as you join me today to look at another chapter of Ecclesiastes, that the first chapter of Ecclesiastes didn't get you down too much. I mentioned in my last video that I did pray pretty long and hard about sharing Ecclesiastes with you because I thought, what we really need right now, God, is, comfort and support. And I just kept coming back to this meaningless, says the master, as Koheleth, the leader of the assembly, kept screaming out. At least we have to read that from the exclamation points he puts in Ecclesiastes 1. But for whatever reason, I believe that there is a time for everything, including to read Ecclesiastes. And this might not seem like the opportune time, but I'll tell you, as I am reading through it, I am actually being comforted. I'm being strengthened. I think, sometimes reading things like Lamentations and reading Ecclesiastes and reading the Psalms and the Proverbs that talk about the bad times or the bad stuff can actually be a good practice to help us put it into a counterpoint. So in my last video, I know it went a little long. It's usually not my intent to go 30 plus minutes. I'm going to try to keep it under 20 today. So let's just get right into it. Today we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and just a couple of words real quick to remind us of the context we're reading this in. Ecclesiastes was most likely written by Solomon, or at least that's what we normally accept it to have been written by. We know from the beginning of Ecclesiastes, these were written by the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. And that word teacher is translated as Koheleth. And in Hebrew, that's the name of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is the Greek word, the Greek translation of the word Koheleth, which means leader of the assembly. Incidentally, the word Ecclesiastes is related to the word ecclesia, which is the word in Greek for church or the assembly or the gathering. So keep that in perspective. I think that's an important thing to remember. And then this word for meaningless, the word for meaningless is Habel, which is actually the exact same name as Abel from Cain and Abel, which there might be something there that might not be. But I think it's important to remember the word meaningless could be translated as misleading. Not that it doesn't have any value or meaning, but it might be misleading. That might be a better translation for you. Also, as we look at the big picture of Ecclesiastes, it's good to look at it through a couple of perspectives. One is the perspective of everything under the sun, so to speak. And that phrase is used multiple times in Ecclesiastes by the teacher, the master, the leader of the assembly, the preacher. And that is very much a context that this experiment, it's really a holy experiment, is what Solomon is doing here, and setting up proof of his results, so to speak. He tests things, and we'll see that in chapter 2. There's another way to look at this. We need to look at this from the perspective of what we know now in the revelation of Jesus Christ and the new covenant and the new commandments. So Solomon lived in a time when Christ had not yet been revealed. He had been promised, but not revealed. So we need to also look at this from a heavenly perspective, a spiritual perspective. And that's part of the reason I shared Cain and Abel in the last video. Cain is an example of the earthly man and doing earthly things for earthly purposes. The sacrifice he presented to God was basically just giving God back what God already gave him, which is fine. That in and of itself is not a terrible thing. However, it's not just about the quality of what is given, it's also the kind of thing that is given. Abel, on the other hand, he gave a sacrifice that was pleasing to the Lord because it acknowledged sin and it acknowledged God's place in the divine picture of all things. So if you really want more on that, you can go back and look at my last video. But today let's look at Ecclesiastes 2, starting at verse 1. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, but that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men as well, men and women singers, and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will also overtake me. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless, for the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things that I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all which he labors under the sun? All his days his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And again, I don't want you to get too depressed while we read this. Did you notice how many times he mentions that something is meaningless, that it's a chasing after the wind, that there's nothing new under the sun? Keep in mind, those are all things of the physical world. Those are all physical acts, things that he did, or things that he achieved, or things that he garnered. When we look at chapter 2, here Solomon is kind of setting up a proof for his final conclusion. And I think it is good to keep in mind the final conclusion. I don't know about you, sometimes I go to the end of the research project just to see exactly what was the point of all of this. It's good to keep it in context. So if you think of Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14, chapter 12, verse 13 says, "Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." So that's Solomon's ultimate conclusion here, okay? Whether you agree with that or not, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that it is a good idea to, fear God and obey his commands. That's faith and practice right there. But in any case, he's kind of walking us through what he did to get to this conclusion. So when you read this stuff, I don't want you to look at this and be like, oh, well, that's what Solomon did. That sounds like a great idea. I should do the same thing. No, actually what he is saying is, I did all this stuff and it was meaningless. And there's a reason why. So a couple things. He starts out with this thought process. Come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, but that also proved to be meaningless. And then he walks us through how seeking his own pleasure was pointless. When we read through, let's see, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4. As we read the verbs here, I know you can't look at the Hebrew verbs, but it's interesting. If you get a chance, go look at the King James version of this. And it has very strange wording. When we see in the NIV version, or possibly like the New Revised Standard Version as an alternative, whatever you happen to be working, he often says that he did something for himself. And I think that's a very important point that he makes. So verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. And incidentally, if you're looking carefully in King James, often it says, I built me, or I planted me. That's a reflexive verb. It's saying that he was the recipient of everything that he did. And that's important. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of trees in them. And again, he did this for himself. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born into my house. Are you seeing the focus here? In everything he did this for himself. It was built and designed with the purpose of pleasure in mind. And ultimately, his decision is, that was foolish. That wasn't a good conclusion. I shouldn't have done this for the purpose of pleasing myself. And specifically, I think it's important to understand that this is a proof. He is scientifically, or at least as scientifically as one can in that time period, he is testing something. He's testing his hypothesis. Maybe pleasing yourself makes you happy. His conclusion is, nope, that's meaningless. And I think specifically as he says, pleasing myself, I did this for myself, it's important to point out that every time he did something for himself, he concluded that that wasn't worthwhile. It was meaningless. He goes on and talks about how he desired nothing. Verse 10, I desired myself, again, nothing my eyes I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. And he does say later that taking delight in your work is a good thing. But, verse 11, yet, when I had surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. And part of the reason he comes to this conclusion is because Solomon is keenly aware that at some point, everything that he has done for himself will pass to another. He switches over to a talk about wisdom and folly, and in your Bible you might see that this is written in a poetic form. Often he kind of narrates what happened, and then he kind of summarizes it with a poetic form here. So it says, then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom. And you'll also know, when he does all of this stuff for pleasure, he says, my wisdom never left me. Meaning, he was doing this with a clinical mind. He was doing this not just randomly. He was trying to specifically see if the stuff that he did that was pleasurable, if it actually was worthwhile. And he said ultimately it wasn't. So he says, I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? And remember, Solomon inherited his father's kingdom. And Solomon was well aware that somebody would inherit his kingdom after him. He sees this cycle of a king comes in, he establishes some stuff, but then he hands it off to someone else. And if you remember, Solomon was the one that was destined to create the temple because David wasn't allowed to complete it. He kind of comes to this conclusion, though, that whether you're wise or a fool, the same fate, verse 14, I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. And he's implying here death. You know, whether you are smart or wise, everybody is going to move on. Everybody's going to pass on. Then I thought in my heart, this is verse 15, the fate of the fool will also overtake me. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless, for the wise man like the fool will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. Now here, I would provide a counterpoint to Solomon, and you'll see later in Ecclesiastes, he also comes to this conclusion. Wisdom is still better than foolishness, because even though a wise man and a fool both have to die, a wise man can do things in such a way during their life that it becomes a good thing for others. As Solomon was talking about planting these gardens and planting the vineyards and all of these different things, reservoirs to water the groves of flourishing trees, I thought, you know, even though he did this for himself, I'm sure other people benefited from this. The planting of the trees in particular reminded me of a few quotes. One of my favorites is from, he's actually an old Canadian farmer, Nelson Henderson. You probably won't find much about him. You know, there's not much about him that can be found book-wise. There are some books out there, but the thing that you may have heard from him before is this. This is his quote: "The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit." And I think there's a lot of truth to that. This idea that once you have come to the realization that, yeah, I am going to move on from this life at some point, but I'm going to do something in this life that will benefit others. That's the true meaning of life. We know from Scripture, greater love has no man than this, that someone would lay down their life for their friends. I don't think that's just about sacrificing your life, in the heat of the moment or as a sacrifice. It's dedicating your life to other people. That the purpose of life is not to make yourself happy, although it is good to take joy in your work and in your labor. The purpose of life is to make other people happy and to serve others. That's what Jesus Christ came to do. He came to serve, not to be served. He came to lay down his life to create a lasting legacy, to build something that would endure. And Solomon couldn't have known this, but when he said neither the wise man nor the fool will be remembered, we are literally reading his words right now because we consider them wise. We do remember Solomon, and we do remember people like Jesus, because not only were they wise, but they left a legacy. And that's one of the blessings of Scripture, that we can read it and have that enduring legacy. Now, another quote that I really love is by a guy named Thomas Fuller. He was a clergyman. He was actually one of the first Englishmen to write and make a living by it. And he has so many wonderful quotes. Look up Thomas Fuller quotes and read all kinds of fun things. The Quaker in me has to laugh at one of them. I think it goes something like, "When you deal with foxes, you must be a fox." I don't know if George Fox ever knew that one. I just think it's funny. But the Thomas Fuller quote that came to mind, though, is, "He who plants trees loves others besides himself." And I think that's true. The value of planting a tree is that it is something that will last, and it's something that will endure. Now, even trees are going to die eventually, and even trees will stop bearing fruit. But a tree is a representation here of something that you establish that will serve others besides you. And that's the whole point. So when Solomon says that he did these things for himself and he explored pleasure, all of the things that he did, ultimately, when it was done for himself, was meaningless. Or at least it was misleading in that interpretation of it. And at verse 17, we see what happens because of this, inquiry. He says, "I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to one who comes after me." And here I think he's got the wrong idea. But again, this is still early in the inquiry. This is still early. He's reporting to us what he did. And I think that's a real wisdom too. Wisdom is not saying I've done it all correctly. Wisdom is admitting to our mistakes and our faults and pointing out, this is where I was. I was in a bad spot. I did all this stuff to try to please myself, and the result to that was that I was miserable. I had this thought that I would establish things, but then I got upset that I would have to give it on to somebody else. But ultimately, that's kind of the goal, or at least it should be our goal. When we serve only ourselves, that's pointless. It's meaningless. It will do nothing to create a legacy or something that will endure. I think of the sacrifice of Jesus. If years ago I decided if I wanted to be like somebody, who would I want to be like? Sometimes you see the memes going around, who'd you want to be when you grow up, or something like that. I never really wanted to be anybody when I grew up. Like, I'd look at people and they'd be famous. I just wanted to be the best me that I could. I didn't know what that meant, but as I explored and studied Jesus more, I thought, here's a guy, obviously the Son of God. I can't really, copy that, but he promises if we follow him, we will do greater things than he did. And we're still talking about him thousands of years later. I call that a legacy. Jesus had no children. He had no home. He, really in many ways, he failed as a human being. If people just look at it from the idea of everything under the sun, this idea that you're supposed to establish stuff, that you're supposed to get things, build a house and plant a garden and, get a wife and 2.5 kids and live the American dream, or in Solomon's context, live the Hebrew dream. By that measure, Jesus was a colossal failure. By the measure that really matters, the kingdom measure, the one that includes this idea of heaven, Jesus is far out past us all. He is the example. He gives us true meaning in life, and he set the example for us to love others. That's what we're called to do. So I think that's what Solomon, is alluding to here. We'll see more as we go on, but I'll leave you with this thought. He does kind of summarize chapter 2. He says at verse 24, "A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, chasing after the wind." And so his summation here is that God gives us happiness and joy in our work, and God also gives us wisdom. So I encourage you today, pray to the Lord. If you are unhappy, if you feel unwise, if you are alone, if you are, just trying to figure it all out. And I'll tell you, that's where we all pretty much are right now. A lot of us are universally miserable. I take some comfort in knowing that Solomon, one of the wisest men that ever lived, was in a similar state. And I also take comfort in this knowledge that even at the conclusion of chapter 2, so early in the discussion, he's pointing us to God, to find our wisdom and our comfort there, and our happiness is in him. So be blessed, friends. I wish you well. I hope to see you all again soon. Pray for me. We'll continue to pray for you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.